So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to turn things over to Jacob, who will introduce our panel.
Thanks, Caitlin. Welcome, everybody. We have a great panel joining us here today. First up, we have Rick Mace. Rick is a sports feature writer for the Washington Post, who has covered a variety of topics throughout his career. He's covered 7 Olympic Games, several Super Bowls, the World Cup, and the World Series. Welcome, Rick. Next up, we have Stella Rouse. Stella is the director for the Center of Democracy and Civic Engagement at the University of Maryland. She's also an associate professor in the Department of Government and Politics here at Maryland and is an author of 2 books published in 2013 and 2018. Welcome, Stella.
All right, great to be here.
Finally, we have Michael Hanmer. Michael is the research director for the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement here at Maryland. He's also an author of a book, Discount Voting, Voting Registration Reforms and Their Effects. Welcome, Michael.
Well, thank you, Jacob. I appreciate that. My name is Mark Hyman. I'm the moderator, although I think I may be kind of switching back between the moderator's chair and a panelist today. But I am the moderator. I'm also the director of the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism. And we're here today to talk about something that I think is very exciting. And it's an initiative that the Povich Center is deeply involved in, and we hope will continue for years into the future. And that is a sports and politics poll in which we are in partnership with 2 great partners who are represented here today. One, of course, is the Washington Post, and Rick Mace is here to talk from a Post perspective. And Rick actually wrote the story that appeared in the Post, I guess, a week ago Wednesday, when the first installment of the results of the poll were released. And then we have Mike and Stella, who are here representing the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement at the University of Maryland. And so they are colleagues of mine here at Maryland. And without their participation, this idea would never have happened. And I'm so grateful to them and looking forward to chatting with them and kind of reconstructing how this came about, because we've been working on this for months and months. So I think the 3 topics that we really want to talk about today. One is the nature of the collaboration and why there are 3 partners involved and how we're all contributing to the poll. And then secondly, to take you a little bit inside the poll and how this process developed, how the topics were decided upon, how the questions were written, what we are doing and intend to do with the data over time. And then thirdly, talk about the results. And here I think Rick Mace I'm really looking forward to hearing from Rick about his analysis of the data and what it tells us about live attendance at sporting events. And there was a second story and data supporting a second story on youth sports and the ways in which the pandemic have really altered and disrupted the sports lives of families. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Before we do that, I thought the obvious place for us to start is with a discussion of our 3 panelists and their attitudes about attending live sporting events in the pandemic. We've been thinking about this as a group for weeks and weeks. What are your views? So let's start with Stella. Would you go to a live sporting event now, Stella?
I would probably go to an outdoor sporting event that had some social distancing. So I would have not been caught dead at the Texas Rangers game with 40,000 fans, 40,000 fans, all sort of packed in like there was no pandemic and we weren't still having surges around the country with different variants. So I'm sort of, I think, comfortable saying that perhaps at Nationals Park, where it's, 15, 20% attendance and mask requirement in a place where I think there's adherence to mask requirement and people are going to follow that I could probably be okay in that scenario.
Yeah, and this issue of enforcement of masking, I think, is something that we're going to be learning more about over time. It's one thing to establish a protocol, but then to actually, effectively enforce it, I think, is another issue that we're going to be learning about. Rick Mace, are you headed to Nets Park or to an indoor event?
Well, I should preface this by saying that my job typically requires me to go to sporting events. That said, I haven't been to one in person in over a year now, so it's been very unusual work period. Personally, I would not be comfortable right now. I'm not scheduled to be at a sporting event in person until June for work, so I feel very, very comfortable with that cushion. But that said, I've got one of my 2 vaccine shots. Once I have the second shot and enough time has passed, I will definitely be looking forward to going to a baseball game. That's a sport that I enjoy. I love hanging out with family and friends at the park, and I really don't think until I have both shots and enough time has passed will I really have a comfort level where I can actually enjoy the game, have a drink, and not have some level of anxiety about what's going on around me and the behaviors of people around me too.
And in fact, the majority of the folks in our survey were expressed a desire to go back to an outdoor sporting event. I think it was 60% or so. So with respect to returning to outdoor events, the majority seem comfortable with that right now.
Yeah, and we specified, like baseball. And I think baseball for people isn't just a competition to go watch, it's a communal event. So you associate it with not just players on the field, but spending time with family and friends in kind of that environment. So I couldn't speak for all the respondents, but if I was responding, I would definitely say I'm looking forward to going to baseball, and it's in part because I'm looking forward to some normalcy and shared experience with family and friends again.
Agreed. Mike.
So I'm similar. I would go to an outdoor event. I've been to lots of youth outdoor events with my daughter's soccer team, and masks are part of the deal. Everybody is socially distant, and I feel pretty comfortable about that. We get a lot of warnings about following protocol, and then you can come and go pretty easily. It's a little bit different with pro sports, and that once you're in the building or on the grounds, it's maybe a little bit harder to move if someone gets too close. So I'm not quite where we would need to be for indoor at all.
Great. Well, we have a range of opinion here. I think that's good. At the top, I neglected to mention that Jacob Steinberg, who introduced the panel, is a fine student in Merrill College of Journalism and in the Povich Center. And this week, Jacob wrote a great story off of the poll, interviewing some of the poll respondents and speaking to the Orioles and to other sports organizations about their protocols. And the story moved yesterday, and I asked Jacob if he would paste the URL into the chat box. And I think it'll be cool for those of us who are at the University of Maryland and those who are fans of the University of Maryland to read what our students are saying about the poll and how the poll is, we're kind of building it into our curriculum. It's going to be a part of the experience that the students have. So eager for you to see that. Okay, I'd like to kind of do a little bit of a drill down on the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement. I think for our audience here at the Povich Center, there may be a lot of folks who are unfamiliar with CDCE and what it does. So Mike and Stella, would you explain for us what it is and then what your roles are? Because your roles are quite different. Stella, why don't you begin?
Sure, and I should have said at the beginning, I'm really happy for this partnership and for being invited on this panel and allowing us to promote our collaborative efforts with the Povich Center and the Washington Post, and really put CDC out there a little bit more, because as Mark said, I think a lot of people on campus perhaps don't know about us, and so any opportunity we can get to kind of tout what we do, we really appreciate it. So I'm the director of the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement. It's a center that has a very short lifespan. We started in 2019, planned to have a big rollout in 2020, and then this thing, the pandemic that you may have heard about, sort of interrupted those plans. And so it's been kind of a slow rollout of the center, in taking opportunities where we can to sort of put our name out there on different events and panels. But really what the center is focused on is really teaching outreach and engagement, right? Teaching research outreach and engagement, and around the issue of civic engagement, and perhaps now more important than ever, the health of our democracy. And so any activities that sort of lend themselves to our ability to engage in that area is really important to us. We've been involved with polling with the Washington Post for several years, and some other entities, the Nielsen survey that I do with another colleague. And so we view polling as an important element to allow us to be a vehicle for teaching research and engagement. And above and beyond the polling, we are engaged in research that surrounds civic engagement and democracy, and we offer courses that have to do with civic engagement. And we're trying to tie all that together, including this new polling collaborative that you have already mentioned that the Povich Center and the School of Journalism is doing. We intend to do that as well. And as we've discussed, and maybe we'll discuss later, some other avenues for collaboration on those fronts.
Mike, I know that you don't have the same job. You have a different job at CDCE. So tell us about it.
Sure. So let me echo what Stella said in terms of our excitement about this new partnership and collaboration. It's really been great, and it's opened up new avenues for me in all sorts of ways. But as research director, I'm looking for strategic opportunities for the center to advance our research, to get more students involved, and to go in different directions. And I can tell you, before you contacted us, Mark, I didn't have any plans to do anything on sports and politics. And now I have a couple of projects on sports and politics, and they're bringing me into new areas of research for my work. I don't do a lot of work on racial and ethnic politics, but this intersection with sports and politics is going to bring me there, and it's going to expand in really interesting ways. So I've been probably the point of contact with the Washington Post since our collaboration back in 2014. And then we really helped launch the center through a series of short but very important surveys we did at the start of the pandemic with the Washington Post. And there's this question that we asked this time that we've asked in those other studies about worry about coronavirus, and attitudes about that predict all sorts of other attitudes and behaviors in really important ways. And so part of what I'm trying to do is figure out what research opportunities there are for the faculty and students, and what other partnerships we can build. So I was absolutely thrilled to get working with you and the Post on this project.
So as both Stella and Mike mentioned, the idea of a partnership around a poll between the Post and the University of Maryland is not new. That's been going on for quite some time. What were the kinds of issues that you were polling before the Povich Center showed up?
Mike, go ahead.
Sure. So we started off looking at Maryland politics first, and we got started during the run up to the election that Governor Hogan ultimately won. And a lot of news came out of that. There were a lot of people surprised that Governor Hogan won, and then there were a lot of people interested in how he was going to govern, what he was going to do. And so we did a lot of polling on Maryland politics. In 2017, we did our first national poll with the Post, reflecting on issues about democracy and the state of democracy in the US. And then again, more recently, we've been looking at a more national sample, looking at COVID. And then also in August, we did another survey on election administration in the time of COVID as well.
So as those of us on the Zoom know, and in the initial stages of this partnership, Scott Clement, our friend, the polling director of the Post, was our point of contact. And Scott has really shepherded this project on the Post side. Rick, at what point do you get involved in the production of a story about a poll that on sports and politics. What was your first, what was the point of entry for you? When did you hear that you were going to be involved?
Yes, probably later than everybody else. I mean, once the partnership exists and we know we're going to move forward with something, then Scott came to me and a handful of editors and said, let's refine what questions we want to ask and where we want to take this particular poll. And so maybe it was a month or so before the poll actually went out in the field. We gathered on Zoom a couple of times, and really they were just brainstorming sessions to begin with. And I'm sure there were things that Maryland wanted to look at on their end, and we wanted to come up with topics that we cared about, not just for this specific poll, but maybe to create some baselines moving forward, things that we want to compare down the road, and really how we might want to use this new relationship. So we had a couple of very, very good Zoom sessions, and then a lot over emails. We refined questions. And so I was happy to be involved in that level of engagement. That way I wasn't just throwing some poll results and had no idea what to do with them, but at least knew ahead of time, some possible stories that might come out of it.
Great. So I think that I should probably speak a little bit about our involvement, even though I'm not going to really ask myself the question. I'll just kind of explain how this came about on our end. I'm relatively new to the University of Maryland. I began as director of the Povich Center in July of 2020, kind of a lonely time to be assuming that responsibility in the kind of the height of the pandemic. But early on, it seemed to me that the Povich Center was in a unique position to really speak to issues of sports and race and gender and ethics and health and safety and politics. We really had an opportunity to be leading a national conversation on those issues. And I began to think strategically about how we could leverage the resources that were available to us to try to make that happen. And a poll was kind of on my mind from a fairly early stage, but I was well aware of the fact that we were going to need many committed partners to make this happen. There was no way that the Povich Center, without the support of others, was going to be able to produce a poll of the kind that we're talking about today. So I believe the first conversation I had was probably sometime in mid to late July with Stella. And, of course, I've never met Mike or Stella. We've done all of this virtually. We've probably met 30 times on Zoom, if not more, but we began this conversation about our mutual interests and the resources that we could bring to this project. And I would say, Stella, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression was that fairly early in our conversations, we had a feeling that there was a match here and that we could get to the finish line.
Yeah, I think even with all the obstacles with the pandemic, right, that I think, and then the 2020 election and everything that came out of that, there were certainly quite a few logs put in the middle of the road in trying to get this to the finish line. But I think the commitment and the trust that we developed early on, and the interest, quite honestly, that we had with this intersection of sports and politics that we really got excited about. And as Mike mentioned, not something that I had really thought a whole lot about before in terms of expanding of the work that we do with the center or even research opportunities, but it really has come about as a great addition to what we're doing and what the center is doing. And you, Mark, have been a great partner. And even before I spoke to you, Lucy, I should give her credit, Lucy Daglish, who's the dean of the School of Journalism, really put us together, or really made the contact for us. And so I appreciate that and opening the door to our collaboration. And yeah, it's come a long way in what seems like a long time, but I guess really in a relatively short amount of time to bring through 3 big entities together to work on this and make it a successful project. So I'm really, really proud of everybody's work on this.
Agreed. Mike, is there anything to add to that or not? I know you're a big sports fan. I've never talked more about the Buffalo Bills than I have in the last 6 months.
Yeah, exactly. No, Stella came to me shortly after she talked to you, and I said, "Yeah, well, I'm all in. Let's do it." And from there, it's been great. And like she said, we've had some roadblocks, some events. We had some interest in trying to do this earlier, but obviously the election kept all of us busy in other ways. But as we've seen, sports interest and sports and politics interest in particular isn't going away. This is something that I think is really important as part of what we're doing and what's going on in the world.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the topics that we've polled here in the initial poll. Again, there's been a story about attendance at live events in the pandemic, and then a second story on youth sports in the pandemic. So let's begin with the attendance side. Let's talk a little bit about the results. And let's start with Rick. Rick, you're putting this story together. You've got a mound of data this high. What are you thinking? I mean, how are you making judgments about where the news is in this data set and in this story?
Well, fortunately, I'm not doing it all by myself. And, as you guys mentioned, we got a great polling team at the Post, and they're used to, skimming through the crosstabs and really looking for the numbers that jump out. And so, I just didn't get I got the raw data, but then I also got kind of a summary that included a long series of bullet points. And it was this topic, but all the other topics too. And so we kind of had initial discussion about, what jumps out, what's newsworthy here, what explains, where we are as a society or just as a sports fandom in general. And we knew when we set out to do the poll that it was going to be kind of timed around opening day. We thought that was maybe somewhat arbitrary, but it's a good excuse to take the pulse of fandom and people's comfort levels. So we kind of knew right away the things we wanted to focus in on for the initial story was people's comfort levels going outside. Every poll is kind of a snapshot in time, and we're kind of measuring where people were feeling in the spring as vaccination numbers were going up, infection rates were kind of plateauing. And it really gives us a sense heading into spring and summer where people are at and their comfort level. And so that's really what jumped out to us, is that there were all these circumstances, people had varying levels of comfort. So while the top line of, yes, this many people are comfortable going to indoor events or outdoor events, this many people aren't comfortable, I really appreciate us being able to break it down by the circumstance, wearing masks, 20% capacity, 50% capacity. So I think that really gives you a more nuanced portrait of just the varying levels of comfort people have with all these different scenarios.
I've got some graphs of some of the data that was featured in the Post story that I thought I would share, and maybe we can kind of talk through these. And I'm going to invite Mike and Stella as well to kind of narrate this. So actually, let me go back here. I think I want to, okay. That's not the one I want to start with. Okay, let's start with this one. How comfortable are you attending an outdoor sporting event like baseball? Did this surprise anyone on the panel? How about so I'm going to take that as no. What about the political, the partisan divide here? Almost 20 points difference between Republicans and Democrats. Is that something that we should have expected?
I mean, I'll let Mike talk a little bit more about this, and I'll just quickly say that, no, given the division of our country, it's not really all that surprising. And, the pandemic and everything surrounding the pandemic, from adherence to mask wearing and other things like social distancing to the vaccine to now talking about vaccine passports, everything is politicized. There is no longer separating sort of science from politics and how those two are imbued together. So I'm not really surprised at the partisan divisions that we saw in this poll at all.
Mike, same?
Yeah, I agree. The magnitude of some of them struck me, but something like this where we see 20 points or so, that's not too surprising. In this current context, right? If you had asked me, even 6 to 10 years ago, I don't think I would have predicted it being this big. I really do think that this is a reflection of what's been happening over the last several years.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think that, polls like this and questions like this really illustrate what kind of a microcosm the sports world can be for the broader society. So, I mean, it wasn't surprising, but I think that's because related polling, when it comes to masks or comfort level of the pandemic, was kind of reflected similar results. So I think we anticipated it. And, when we ask these kind of questions that where social issues intersect with sports, whether it's kneeling for the anthem or Colin Kaepernick or things along those lines, I mean, I think we see a very similar partisan divide in some of the responses.
Rick, if you were the commissioner of baseball or the owner of a baseball team, and on opening day, 66% of your customers said, yeah, I feel comfortable coming to the ballpark, would you be encouraged by that or discouraged?
Well, I mean, you gotta think of the context there. They just went a whole season or half of a season last year without any fans. So on one hand, I think they're probably happy to have any number of fans and any number of paying customers coming through the gates. On the other hand, you project forward and you realize, maybe it's not a sustainable business model if I can't grow that number. So, I think there is some optimism right now, and the baseline everyone's starting with on opening day, they expect to increase as the season progresses. And, by spring and summertime, I think everyone's hoping that they'll be allowing a lot more fans into the stadium. And it's really up to kind of a lot of local jurisdictions and health authorities to make some of those decisions. But I think owners, are happy with the number because it's more than zero, but they're also very hopeful that it's going to inch closer to Texas Rangers territory, in the coming weeks and months.
So there's been previous polling, of course, on some of these questions. And I know Mike has been following that, I think, more closely than the rest of us. Have these numbers moved in either direction, Mike?
So one of the things that really stood out to me was, a question, we asked regularly about COVID worry, and that, as I mentioned earlier, that predicting things, that held up. That's the same here. I think also, optimism about when things will be back to normal has moved a little bit, but it's still not particularly high. So I think there are a lot of people that are still concerned. And then, we've seen, the Democratic Republican split for a long time. So that's pretty steady.
Let's look at some of the other. How comfortable are you returning to a stadium where attendees are required to wear masks? So here, of course, the percentage of Democrats is higher than Republicans, but a slightly narrower percentage. What surprised me here is that there is not more of a range with respect to the age demographic. Now, I expected that 65 and older would be significantly lower than this. I wonder if our professional pollsters and political scientists took note of that.
I can jump in this one. Yeah, that surprised me too. There's always things that we always wish we had more time on the survey to ask questions. There's always questions that are really good that we leave off the table. And then of course there's things that come up, but one of the issues that might be going on here is, that age group was first in line to get vaccinated, and that might, instill a little bit of confidence. I'm speculating there a little bit, but things like that might be at play. But overall, that is surprising. And then here, the interesting thing about the Democrats being more comfortable than Republicans, I think that sort of goes back to maybe some things about just overall attitudes about restrictions and things like that, which I think is interesting to point out.
Yeah, I want to jump off on that a little bit because what caught my eye about this is really, are Republicans really expressing the actual requirement, right, in a discomfortable way, whereas Democrats are expressing it in a comfortable way, right? And Mike's right about the fact that this type of question would be really interesting to explore with other questions, right, to get at exactly where those numbers are coming from. But I suspect that those numbers between Republicans and Democrats are not being motivated by exactly similar reasons for the comfort level with masks.
Mark, the thing when it comes to the age breakdown that I guess jumped out at me was actually the vaccination question. And I know we talked about this a bit before, but the poll showed that people that had been vaccinated are more likely to feel uncomfortable attending an event versus unvaccinated adults. And I don't know, that just kind of struck me because it's almost counterintuitive. Like I said, if I have the vaccine, I'm going to feel a lot more comfortable there. But it could be just something about that age demographic and the way they've kind of survived the pandemic that gives them some reservations and hesitations about exposing themselves further.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rick. How comfortable are you returning to a stadium where attendees are not required to wear masks? And here we really see the partisan divide. Mike, can you explain that? That's pretty dramatic.
Yeah, this really jumped out at me. This I think reflects what's been going on in the broader discourse. Republican elected officials and other leaders have expressed different attitudes about masks. I think some of that reflects what they were seeing on the ground, but I think some of it just reflects other issues, and that's gotten out to their constituencies. I think. I mean, we saw early on in the pandemic some protests that got a lot of media coverage. Those tended not to line up with public opinion at the time. Those seemed to be isolated incidents, but I think since then there's been a broader coming together with like-minded partisans on a lot of the issues related to the pandemic and what to do about it and how to behave and what the government should do and what local organizations like sports organizations should do.
Stella, you want to weigh in on this at all?
No, I think Mike said it really well. I think these results are completely reflective of what's been going on in broader society and politics in terms of attitudes about the coronavirus and what elites have sort of driven that message to regular people from each party about how they view risk, how they view the coronavirus, and I think this reflects it, I think, pretty well.
Rick, how does a sports organization, how does a franchise interpret this data? And does it inform in any way the protocols that you might put in place, or you just have to ignore the partisanship and go with the public health protocols?
I mean, they kind of don't have a choice at this point because they're all kind of subject to these public health protocols. So I think if you ask the owner of the Washington Nationals or any kind of baseball team, they want as many fans in there as possible. Now, of course, they'll tell you they want to do it safely and have all these safety measures in place. But the truth is, they're running a business and they want to make sure, like any other business, they're able to operate and survive during these tough times. So I don't know if it informs or changes the way they do things. I'm sure they're curious to see where public sentiment kind of lies. But their goal is really to make sure that they can get people into the games, and if they can take something from this that lets them realize how they can create a comfortable atmosphere, they're going to do it. But they're really taking direction from local health authorities, and that's who's setting the attendance caps, at least in a place like Washington, D.C. right now.
Yeah. And this is the last slide and kind of takes us back to the beginning. How comfortable are you attending an indoor sporting event like basketball, and as opposed to the outdoor sports numbers, which exceed 60%, the indoor numbers are in the 30s. So if you were Ted Leonsis, or in the ownership group of the Caps and the Wizards, would this be terrible news or better than expected, do you think, Rick?
I mean, I think it's pretty terrible news, at least compared to the baseball and the outdoor sporting event numbers. And I mean, on one hand, it's heartening because it shows you that some people can differentiate between gathering outdoors and gathering indoors. That there was such a large gap between those two figures. But we're getting close to NBA final playoffs and NHL playoffs, and the owners are eager to have fans back in there. They went all last season without ticket holders. They're looking at a second straight season without any kind of ticket revenue, which is a huge part of what they rely on to keep their business in operation. We just saw this week that in Washington D.C. They've said the Nats can have limited fans. I believe the soccer team DC United has also been given some kind of exemption, but the DC government is not allowing for any fans still for Monumentals teams, the Caps and the Wizards. So and the Wizards came out, and Ted Leonsis and his company made statements saying that they were frustrated and they've been trying to work with local officials and they just can't get anywhere. So they're still waiting, and they're clearly frustrated, and they're eager to have fans back in the building, both for competitive but also financial reasons.
Mike?
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. I think this is not surprising to me, but certainly I could see the perspective from the owners that this is very discouraging. Having I know that these professional sports arenas are built extremely well, and it's very different sort of atmosphere. But I grew up playing hockey. I have a nephew who plays hockey, and I sort of cringe when I think about playing hockey right now. I love the sport. If one of my kids played hockey, I think I'd be really reluctant to let them continue doing that, both because it's indoors, but also because it lines up with the other sorts of concerns. And again, I've been in enough smelly locker rooms in my day to know what it's just stuff passes through. I'm not a health expert, but I've gotten sick enough myself in those environments. I would be concerned, and so I'm not surprised that these numbers are much lower than the numbers outdoors. And to me, it suggests that people are paying attention to what health officials are recommending in many ways.
And just to add to that, Mark, I mean, I think we're at a point now where most NBA teams and most NHL teams are allowing fans. So in the NHL, the Canadian teams, none of them are allowed to have fans, but all but I think two of the US-based teams, the Capitals and Blackhawks, out of Chicago. Those are the only two teams that have zero fans or no plans for fans right now. And in the NBA, I think maybe there's a half dozen or so that still don't allow fans. So that changes every week, because we are seeing that restrictions are loosening in cities across the country. And just seems like DC is one that they haven't quite found a way to have fans in the building there yet.
Look, before we leave these slides, I just want to give a shout out to Adam Martin and his team of data journalist students at Capital News Service, who put together these slides, and they're just great, and really appreciate the work that Adam and his team did on these. Rick, this is a question that I can't think of anybody better to ask than you. What is the new normal with regard to sports venues when the pandemic is a memory? So we're talking about the U.S. professional leagues, but you cover the Olympics. What is the world going to look like for sports fans attending live events post-pandemic?
Well, I mean, you can ask me that now, and it could be different than last week and different, a week from now. I think the new normal is just ever changing right now. It's probably going to be that way for a while until we reach, a herd immunity or some level of vaccination. But I think the new normal is just constantly checking the conditions on the ground. And what that means is you're going to have a different idea of normal in Los Angeles and in Dallas and in Washington, D.C., or even Baltimore, because conditions change from place to place. So you might have capacity limits where it's only safe to have 10% in a city, but another place, the virus might be completely under control, and maybe they feel comfortable having 75% or even 100%. So I think everyone's hoping that we're heading in a certain direction, and that we're seeing, 2 or 3 million people a day getting vaccinated. We're seeing infection numbers at least level off, and hopefully at some point it starts dipping. But then there's other places, and this could be certain cities in the US, parts of Europe. Right now there's cities in Japan, while they're relatively low numbers, the numbers are growing from week to week, and that's a cause of concern for Olympic organizers. And while we might feel comfortable hosting a baseball game here, in Japan right now, they're really starting to wonder, how are we going to pull off this Olympics when the numbers in Tokyo are rising, and less than 1% of the population there has been vaccinated. So conditions change, and I think that just means the idea of normal just means something different to every community, every team, and every league right now.
What are you hearing about protocols at the summer games in Tokyo?
For people that don't know, I cover Olympics is probably my primary beat responsibility this time of year. So we've already been given a lengthy playbook of kind of restrictions and protocols that we'll be asked to adhere to when we get there. So right now in Japan, you can't even, for a tourist or a visitor, it's not even an option to visit the country. It's kind of locked down to people. But for a media member, they're not going to require quarantine, so that's good news. I probably will have to produce a negative test before I'm allowed in the country. And then from there, we're going to have apps on our cell phones where they're going to kind of use for contact tracing, but it's also possible they're going to be able to track our movements. We're not allowed in the subway. We're not allowed in restaurants and bars and any kind of tourist areas. Our existence there is really going to be hotel room and sporting venue. And so I'm not quite sure how we're going to do our meals or our off hours when we're not working. But right now they have very severe restrictions in place. And I think our hope has been that conditions there are going to improve and they'll loosen some of these restrictions. But we're not at that point yet. That just doesn't apply to media members. It's for athletes as well. Usually, athletes, just like anybody else, they enjoy going to these countries because they want to interact with the local people. They want to go see the sights. And in Rio, they want to, go see Sugarloaf. And in Beijing, they wanted to go see the Great Wall of China. Well, athletes are going to be under the same restrictions. They're going to be living in the Olympic Village with thousands of other athletes, and really just Olympic Village, shuttle bus, competition venue, and that's going to be their Japanese experience. So, certainly it's going to be disheartening and disappointing for a lot of people, but the main purpose of the games is to have the competitions themselves, and they're still hopeful they can pull that part off.
Rick, will your athletes be limited?
Oh, I mean, it definitely will. And they're still sorting out some of the details there, but, typically we'd go to events and we'd have access to them in what's called a mix zone afterward. Athletes kind of walk through, they stop, you answer questions. Sometimes you're just, a foot or two away from them. Then there might be a press conference setting where you're also, in the same room talking to the athletes in person. And it's totally possible, and they're still working out details, but it's possible we might never interact face-to-face with the athletes. It might be completely virtual, even though we're in the same city, or in some cases the same building or venue. Hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully we all feel safe and comfortable, and the virus is kind of under a certain level of control by then. But I think we're prepared to kind of continue covering sports in a virtual setting the way we have been for the past year.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about fans at the Olympics. I believe this is correct, that fans from outside of Japan are not going to be able to attend events at these Olympics. Am I right about that?
Yeah, you're right. Just a couple of weeks ago, they made that decision that there's only going to be Japanese spectators allowed in the stands. Now, they haven't made decisions yet on capacity or how many spectators we're talking about, but they've been especially cautious there, and they felt swinging open the gates to the country to people from all over the world was endangering Japanese people and really setting a stage for a virus that maybe was under control to start spreading. So they're not just worried about the Olympic Village or a media hotel, they're worried about all the people in Tokyo and really variants coming in and spreading like wildfire. So the one way they're hoping to limit that is really controlling the number of people that come into the country and controlling the way they move around the country and interact with the local people.
So we have some great comments in the chat box. I just wanted to invite people, if they have topics that they would like to be explored in future polls, drop them in the chat box now, and we will vet them for you. We'll have a 15-second period where we'll talk about your idea, and we probably won't give away too much about what we're thinking in the future, but it would be great, I think, to have your ideas about topics that are at this crossroads of sports, politics, race, gender, health and safety, ethics, technology, that might be topics for us to explore in future polls. So while we're waiting for your feedback, let's talk a little bit about the second story that we explored, or that the Post ran based on our questions and polling, and that was on youth sports. So I think we're all parents on this panel, and we all know the hardship of having your kids kind of prisoners in your house and not able to participate in youth sports. Are there results, Stella, that jumped out? I don't know how closely you read that story and looked at the data. What do you think was notable on the youth sports polling?
Well, I think the most notable thing to me was seeing how much parents felt that the lack of sports impacted their kids, right, on a whole host of dimensions, particularly sort of the social interaction one and the development. They're hindering their development over the last year. So I'm not terribly surprised that those were the results, but a little, I guess, sad to see that. In terms of how parents have seen the effects, or how they view the effects of the pandemic and the lack of their kids being able to participate in sports on a number of dimensions. So I think that was a really important thing to ask about, that has, wide-ranging ramifications, and I'm sure we can talk about that. That's kind of what stood out to me.
Mike?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think, one of the things that we're going to be looking at for a long time in terms of sports, and then broader in terms of education and child development is the effect of the pandemic on mental health. And that came through in this survey. I mean, none of us, knew how to deal with this. But as adults, we've had a little bit more experience dealing with things. It was a little bit easier for us as adults to adjust than it was for kids in many ways. And so sports can be a big part of a kid's identity growing up, and to have that removed and have that social structure and just structure in general removed is a big shock. And we have to take that seriously as we're thinking about this. And I think there's also a local politics story here down the line too, just people getting more involved. And one of the things I remember hearing a news report about, my local high school team canceled, the track, the ability of the team to go to the state meet because of concerns about COVID outbreak in the Virginia Beach area. Those sorts of things wouldn't have made the news before, I don't think, but this was, broadcast TV, it just came across, and we're gonna have to think about that. One other quick thing, students in my current GVPT 479M class are here, and they contributed to the survey too, and they'll continue to work on the data. So I want to give a plug to them as well. It's been great.
That's great. Rick, what stood out to you about the youth sports polling?
I think it was just the number around, how many people feel like their kids' happiness has been affected. I think it was maybe 2 in 3 people, 65, 66%. And that's just a startling number to me. And it makes you realize that, even when this is over and we feel like life is normal again, the ripples of this thing are going to be felt for years, because this is a generation of young people that had the door slammed shut on this important outlet. It's just somewhat heartbreaking to think that while they're in this developmental stage, they lost this social outlet, competitive outlet, all the positive things we think of sports contributing to young people. Hopefully they're picking it up and they're able to fill some of those holes, but they just lost a whole year of it. It might've been, meeting a coach or a mentor or building some self-esteem, but just so that general idea of happiness, and the parents observe that from their children, really struck me and has resonated with me ever since I first saw that.
Yeah, and I wonder about kids who have kind of lost touch with organized sports, and whether it's whether we can assume that those kids are going to re-engage. You know, will there be an attrition rate that's attributable to this break? And that would be a shame for all of the reasons that we've mentioned.
Hey, Mark, on that note, also, we think about some of the broader results in terms of avid fan interest decreasing some. We saw that in the poll. And so thinking about that overall, I'm sure that weighs on the mind of owners and, professional sports folks about wanting to get fans back in the stands to avoid any kind of long-term thing. But then it also speaks to, you build that fandom at an early age with young people. And so if that's been broken to some extent because of the pandemic, what does that mean down the road for avid sports fans of all the different sports? So I thought about that as well when I saw those numbers in terms of the avid sports fan decrease, not by, tremendous amounts, but certainly by some over the pandemic that I think, warrants us kind of keeping an eye on to see how that plays out moving forward.
Yeah, and I'm sure as Rick's story was read in New York and Washington and other places where professional sports are played, that's the lens through which ownership was reading these stories, concerned about what does it mean for the business of professional sports. So there are lots of great suggestions and comments here. So I'm going to read 2 or 3 at a time, and then we can react to them. So these are recommended topics for future polling. Title IX and gender equity. Here's an interesting comment. Would it be possible to include independence in future polls? Gender inequality in sports in terms of coverage and pay. And then acceptance of steroids in sports. Would you watch a sport if it allowed steroid use? So we're not going to give it a thumbs up or thumbs down necessarily, but that's a provocative one. Acceptance, of course, Title IX, definitely, super important topic, and one that I'm sure we will want to, gauge attitudes about. This one about acceptance of steroids in sports. Would you watch a sport if it allowed steroid use? Rick, what's your take on that? Do you think people are less likely to watch sports if they think the athletes are cheating?
I'm not sure that's really borne out entirely. People might take a temporary reprieve from certain sports, but they always seem to gravitate back. I think, not that anyone's numb to cheating in sports, but we're familiar with it now, right? We've been through baseball, we've been through Olympic scandals, we've been through Lance Armstrong. And not that we're forgiving of it, but we kind of understand that it exists. It might be under the table, but you watch some sporting events with a skeptical eye and an understanding that maybe not everyone's competing above board. I think what I like about all these topics is that this partnership could allow us to kind of show the change in some of these attitudes over time. So steroid, we might see something totally different now versus 20 years ago versus 20 years from now. And I think about the same thing with like sports gambling. Quarter century ago, people were not on board with that. And now suddenly it's becoming very commonplace and people just accept it. So I'd love to see some of these topics, not just in, our next poll, but in polls down the road, so we can kind of measure how fans' attitudes change. In Maryland, if we're going to introduce sports gambling, maybe what we find out today is going to be much different 2 years from now when there's a sports book at Pimlico or Laurel Racetrack. So I think these are really good suggestions.
Yeah. Here are a couple of others. It would be interesting to look at what sports are preferred by different political groups. For example, do Democrats like hockey and baseball? Is there a correlation in geography and economic status? I don't know. Mike, has there been polling on party affiliation and affinity for a favorite sport?
So we have that in there, and I just put a link in the chat that will take people to the Washington Post site, where they do a great job of linking to the stories, and then people can get the crosstabs that have been released themselves in the top line. So we do have independents in there. We do have breakdowns in the crosstabs of fandom by different categories, and I took that's new to me, frankly. Like, I was surprised that only 22% or so of people said they were not fans. There's some differences by race, and African Americans are much less likely to say they're not a fan of sports at all, by a pretty wide margin. You see differences by race in terms of preference for various sports, and then you can take a look. I didn't spend a lot of time on this, and I don't think there's been much research on this. But you can take a look at those crosstabs and see whether Democrats and Republicans differ. I'll do that when somebody else starts talking and chime in if there's anything that pops out to me.
Here's another comment that I think this is a great topic. Fan opinions and behaviors toward players, teams, leagues, venues, brands that are vocal or active on social justice. That's a career right there. That's such a rich topic. Rick, have you written about that issue?
So a little bit, and there has been polling on the topic. I would say that one area that if you're a sports team or league, and you kind of touched on this a bit, Mark, that you're interested in is when you're looking at the demographics, it's really young people, and it's this Generation Z, which is just a huge population that is inherently different than my generation or older generations. If you think about it, they've grown up with, and probably some of your students on this call are part of this generation, but they don't know life without a smartphone in their pocket. And the way they access information and engage with the world is just inherently different. And what we've seen, other polls have shown, is that their sports interest and their ways of engaging with sports is also inherently different. They don't sit down and watch a 3-hour game. They might be more likely to consume like a highlight. And as it comes to social justice, polling shows Generation Z cares a lot about social justice issues. And I think it's no accident that you saw the NFL, suddenly embrace some of these things that they were, just polar opposite against. The NCAA tournament, we saw the words equality on the side of the court. Leagues like the WNBA are very public in the way they embrace some of these issues. And I think it's sincere in a lot of things, but I think it's also strategic, and it's a way to cast your net out there and tell young people, your future consumers, hey, we care about the same issues that you do. We're a product that you can see yourself aligned with.
Well, let's end with a question from Jacob Steinberg, our student who wrote the great story about Off the Poll that ran Capitol News Service. And Jacob's question goes to the issue of, what is the value of continuing to poll these issues? Should we constantly be looking for new issues and seeking out opinions about areas where we haven't polled? Or is there as much value in continuing to poll these issues that we've already explored? So Mike and Stella, what are your thoughts about that?
I think there's value in both. I think as what we're seeing more and more of is a greater intersection of sports and politics that really lends itself to new areas to poll in that I think have not been really richly pulled in. And that was one of the motivations, I think, for all three entities that are involved in this collaboration to do this, is because there isn't a significant amount of sports polling that's gone on, and certainly that has tackled a lot of these emerging issues, right? We talked about, I think some of the people on the Zoom mentioned about Title IX, and we're getting into issues of transgender sports and what's going on in different states and how that affects Title VII and Title IX moving forward. So there's just so much there that I think we can work with that keeps just intersecting with politics and sports. There's no getting away from that. By the same token, I think it's important to, as Rick mentioned, right, if we can get multiple polls, across years, we can certainly gauge trends in attitudes about how they change. And so I think there's value in doing both and moving forward with both of those things in mind.
Yeah, I'll try to be short. I agree 100% with what Stella said. And as a survey researcher, I'm very greedy. I want to do all of it. So the more we can learn, the better. We can learn a lot from asking the same questions multiple times, and we certainly have to ask new questions on new topics as they emerge.
Well, we are out of time. I want to thank our panel so much. You're panelists today, but you're really teammates in this effort in the longer term. And Scott Clement of the Post as well, the polling director I mentioned, So, personally, I'm grateful to all of you for this collaboration that I think is so exciting and is contributing so much to the Povich Center. And I want to thank the audience too, particularly for all your suggestions about future topics. So that will definitely be the conversation or a topic of conversation at our next Zoom meeting. Last thing before we go, I wanted to mention our next panel, which is going to be April 29th. And the topic is going to be whistleblowers in sports. So we'll be talking about sources who step forward and sports journalists who tell their stories. And it's just a wonderful panel. We'll be announcing the names of the panelists in a few days, but April 29th, 7 p.m. The moderator is going to be my colleague, Kevin Blackiestone, actually a colleague of Rick Mace's as well, because Kevin writes frequently for the Post. So again, thank you to the audience. Thank you so much, panel. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.